Friends, it's a great honor and joy to welcome tonight our very dear and esteemed friend, Mr. Paul Lample.
Friends, of course you know this has been quite a wonderful and exciting year for the faith as we've observed the centenary of the birth of Baha'u'llah. And to some extent, you've been able to follow through the website the various activities and got a glimpse in real time of the activities as they unfolded across the world. But I think whatever you were able to understand from that was really just a drop of the kinds of things that we were hearing at the World Center in thousands, really, of pages of reports and in videos and in photographs and so on. The friends described the range of their activities, and almost anything that you can imagine happened. There were places where there were just a few people gathered. There were large gatherings which were mostly Baha'is. There were large gatherings where just a few Baha'is were able to mobilize and attract scores, if not hundreds of people to come. There were meetings in homes, at the houses of worship, even in stadiums in a couple of places. People gathered in stadiums because of the large numbers. And probably in terms of the reach from the media and proclamation, it was probably tens of millions of people who heard about the bicentennial. And in terms of participation, the numbers exceeded 1 million. And then out of that 1 million who participated with us, probably over 100,000, somewhere between 100 and 200,000 we estimate, were people who actually then remained involved with the activities of the Baha'i community after that event. So just as the House of Justice anticipated in the Rizvan message from the previous year, that year would present the single greatest worldwide opportunity there has ever been for connecting hearts to Baha'u'llah. Well, we saw that play itself out over the past year. And then, of course, at this same time as we were making that effort, we see the news from the world around us, the continual crises that humanity is facing, how it's accelerating in various ways, different problems that we thought humanity had addressed. We now see ourselves faced with addressing these once more. And this is exactly the vision that the Guardian had of this process of the breakdown of the old world order simultaneous with the rise of a new one. And Shoghi Effendi reminded us that as the fabric of present-day society heaves and cracks under the strain and stress of portentous events and calamities, as the fissures attenuating the cleavage separating nation from nation, class from class, race from race, and creed from creed multiply, the prosecutors of the plan must evince a still greater cohesion in their spiritual lives and administrative activities, and demonstrate a higher standard of concerted effort, of mutual assistance, and of harmonious development in their collective enterprises. So these two processes are linked. And exactly the more the trials we see coming from the wider society, the more then that we have to respond to the tasks at hand and not be swept up into those currents and forces that are occurring all around us. Now, if we reflect about some of the sources of this problem, we can see that it's really tied up with a quest for people trying to understand who they are and what the story is that they're a part of. Different peoples, different nations, different groups see reality differently, and they have a different sense of understanding about who they are and what they should be doing. And these don't always go in a harmonious way with the stories of other people. and the way that those people feel that things should be done. And so what we see is as this common understanding, this sense of a story that binds a nation together, or that binds the people of one religion together, or one religion with the general population. As these stories start to erode, then we start to see these tensions and conflicts, even war and oppression and so on. Now, this happens, we can see it in the realm of philosophy and so on. Different stories, like this idea of the Enlightenment story that arose from the West, with the idea that reason would be able to solve humanity's problems, and gradually, if we're able to keep the emotions from religion in check, that then a secular society would gradually spread across the world and solve human problems through reason. And then for a lot of reasons, no small percent, because that story masked issues like imperialism and racism and so on, well, it couldn't embrace all the people of the world, and it failed, and it created questions and skepticism, and gave rise to a kind of postmodern relativism where people felt that any big story would mask injustice. It was an attempt by some to impose their views on others. We see in the political realm the move from, over the period of time since Baha'u'llah came, from princes to nations to different ideologies to the clash of civilizations, now move again to an eroding of a global order back toward nationalism again. All of these different voices staining the pages of history with the blood of tens of millions of people and the oppression of many more over the course of the last century. Now, recently a thinker wrote a book about the concept of identity. And he said basically the crisis that humanity is facing fundamentally is a crisis of identity. And he traced this to the beginning of World War, or to the World War I, where in a certain sense, the sense of how society should be developed and what our place in it was shattered by that event. And then in different fields, initially in literature, later in philosophy, then in psychology, this question of identity began to emerge. It was a word that existed before World War I, but not in its modern sense. And so people began to think and try to figure out who am I? What group do I form? How do I see myself in relationship to others in society? And then not just a description of who I am, but then also part of identity is a normative component that tells us what we ought to do if we're a member of this group, if this is part of our identity. So in various fields of endeavor, this question of identity was raised. And we see it now all around us in various forms, but an inability to take and fit these various pieces of identity. It's as if the world was, let's say, this image on stained glass, and then it was dropped, and now it's shattered, and now all the attempts to kind of put the pieces back together have been unsuccessful. So there's a clash between these various ways of creating an identity, and also we make identity opposed to other identities. We can't reconcile all these pieces back into one story. Now, of course, this is really part of Baha'u'llah's diagnosis of this problem. He said that the world's equilibrium has been upset through the vibrating influence of this most great, this new world order. So this previous stage of human development, the adolescent stage of human development, which had brought humanity very far, had raised very high ideals, and had promoted human progress, now kind of reached its limit. And so Baha'u'llah's revelation comes and deranges the equilibrium of the world. And of course, Shoghi Effendi describes this in many different ways, in terms of this process of integration, the process of disintegration. He talks about the decline of true religion and and the light of religion going out, and then materialism beginning to flourish. He talked about the false gods of materialism and nationalism and communism. He talked about, in terms of the American nation, the evil tendencies of political corruption, of moral laxity, and ingrained prejudice. And he gave the vision that Baha'u'llah gave of the future of processes leading to the lesser peace, and then beyond that, of course, to the most great peace. Now, for Baha'is, when we see this cacophony of things happening around us, well, we should understand exactly what it is. It might be reasonable for people who don't have the perspective we have from Baha'u'llah to become very agitated by this and wonder what's happening and what could be done about it. And actually their response in trying to make things better might actually be to increase the agitation and to increase the division. But for Baha'is, of course, we're equally worried when we see these things in the world, but we shouldn't be equally confused, because this is exactly what was described to us by Baha'u'llah and Abdul Baha and Shah Effendi. So we have to, if we don't already have that deep and profound understanding of what's going on around us, well, then we have to read what Shah Effendi said, and we have to understand it, because he also tells us there then what we have to do to respond to it. Now, Baha'u'llah talks in his writings that all the things that are needed for the elevation and upliftment of humanity and for the resolution of these problems are found in his writings. But the Guardian explains to us that for the most part, people have caught up, and this is when he was writing, so many decades ago. He said, for the most part, people have already caught up to the broad principles of Baha'u'llah. The need for peace, the equality of men and women, the need to eliminate prejudice. They know those general principles. But he said that the deeper teachings of Baha'u'llah, the teachings that have a capacity to rearrange the framework of society, these teachings they don't know about. And so Baha'is have to come and study them and be able to present them enticingly to the world. So I thought that at least part of what I want to share with you today is just a few thoughts of my own about some of these teachings. I think there are many of them. It's impossible to cover them all. I'm just going to highlight just a couple so that we can think about some of the implication of these deeper teachings of Baha'u'llah to reorder the affairs of society. So first among these is, I think, what Baha'u'llah provides for humanity is a story, but not a story that just speaks to one segment of society, just to Europeans, let's say, or just to the people of a certain religion. But he presents a story, the story of the great peace, of the establishment of the lesser peace, of how humanity is moving from these various stages of its development, from infancy to childhood to adolescence, and now to the age of maturity, from clans to tribes to kingdoms, city-states, nations, now to the establishment of a global order. So this story, Baha'u'llah says, is one that's fully in line with science. So it's not some story that ignores science. It's a story that takes science into account. And it's also a story that takes all the different elements of humanity and combines it into one story. So every people, every group, every nation has a part to play. They're all protagonists in the building of this global world. It's not that some people who have all the money, or some people who have all the political power, or some people who have technical know-how are going to sit into a corner and create a global order and then roll it out across the peoples of the world. It's, in fact, every one of these populations have a culture, a way of understanding the world, a piece that they need to contribute to the building of this new world. So all have to be protagonists in this process, according to this story of Baha'u'llah. So, of course, this story is already unfolding. It's not the same as the time of Baha'u'llah. There already is a global arrangement, and it didn't exist at the time of Baha'u'llah, but through, again, the propelling acts of the world wars and various other difficulties of humanity, we had a League of Nations, we have the United Nations. It's not adequate. What we have is a global order, but a global order that's still imperfect, that's still not capable of dealing with the global problems of humanity. So the reach of government goes so far, and then the reach of business, the reach of terrorism, the reach of drugs, the reach of various actors go to the global stage, but act in different ways that contribute more to the disequilibrium than the equilibrium. So this order that we have is kind of halfway rolled out. And again, not everybody is engaged in the process of building it, but Baha'u'llah envisions that we have to make it possible, that everybody has a part to play in this. In a sense, it's this concept that the House of Justice is talking about of the individual and the community and the institution. Each has a part to play. But if you look at the development of the world or how different societies are organized, they might highlight one or the other of these elements, like individual or the collective, or the institutions of the state, for example. So there's a disequilibrium in the way that these things are perceived, which are characteristics of the adolescent stage of the human race. Now we have to figure it out. We don't know. We have insights from what Baha'u'llah said, but we haven't quite figured out the pattern of how do these things come together. How are they not antagonistic, but actually coherent and mutually supportive, so that individuals arise and fulfill their role. The community is not just a space, but also a protagonist, and the institutions as well are protagonists of building this new world. So this story that Baha'u'llah gives, we have to learn how to convey it. It's a story that encompasses all humanity and describes for us where we're going into the future. Another element of, a profound element of Baha'u'llah's teachings is his teaching about the oneness of humanity. He said, you're the fruits of one tree, which basically, that simple verse has eliminated all of the divisions of the past and creates a single human identity where we have to recognize fundamentally that we're all one. Now, this is a profound revolution from all past history. As long as the human race existed, it existed as groups of us versus them. Now, sometimes those groups would get bigger and bigger. And in fact, some evolutionary psychologists have traced the evolution of human culture as a means of cooperating at ever higher levels. And then a group that cooperates better outcompetes the other groups. This is how, this even affects the course of human evolution. So this pattern of humanity cooperating and forming ever larger groups is evident. But now, if we're going to get to the global stage, we have to figure out how to eliminate the them. There are no more them. There's only us. As Abdu'l-Baha says, well, maybe some are in need of education. So fine, then they should be educated. Some are in conflict. Fine, they should be taken and peace should be established. Some are in need. Those needs should be met. So we have to begin to see ourselves as one, without another, no other, just us. And of course, part of that exists in a component of the teachings that have a very personal view of one human being to another. It's not just some blending of an abstraction of the oneness of humanity, but we're told in Paris Talks, for example, Abdu'l-Baha says, each sees in the other the beauty of God reflected in the soul, and finding this point of similarity, they are attracted to one another in love. So we see in each other the divine creation. That's the bond that unites us. So when we think then, well, what does it mean to be human? And Baha'u'llah starts to describe that for us. Human beings are not animals. Human beings have an intellect. They have spiritual capabilities and intellectual capabilities that lift them above the animal kingdom. And every human being is endowed with these capabilities, with these fundamental capabilities of what it means to be human. And each human being then has to exercise those capabilities. And the human society as a whole has to nurture and protect the rights of each individual being to exercise those capacities of what it means to be human. Part of it is human freedom, that all have a conscience, all have a voice, all have human agency. And each has to learn how to exercise those kinds of capabilities. Now, when we look around us, we see in the world, in the 7 billion people that inhabit the planet, well, some human beings face grave obstacles to be able to express those capabilities of what it means to be human. They don't have enough to eat. They're not free from disease. They have no shelter. So there's even minimal needs that one has to have if they're able to express what it means to be a human being. But then there's also forces at work, negative forces, which subtract from human agency, from human capacity. So, as you recall maybe from Secret of Divine Civilization, Abdu'l-Baha talks about the masses of humanity being oppressed because they lack education and they lack religious teachings. And so they don't even have a voice to be able to articulate the forces of their own oppression. So we see it in the extremes of wealth and poverty, where wealth is concentrated in just a handful of people. The latest figures they're saying is half the world's wealth is in the hand of 8 people. So 8 people have as much wealth as 3.5 billion people on the planet. So how much agency, how much freedom, how much voice does that 3.5 billion people have in a structure of the existing world? So then to eliminate these forces of oppression that are robbing people of their agency, that are robbing them of their freedom. And this freedom, by the way, what Baha'u'llah talks about, is not that freedom which allows somebody to pursue whatever they want to do as long as they don't hurt one another. What he's talking about is freedom to be a human being. Freedom from our animal nature, which brings us down and makes us basically just pursue our material self and our material desires. So in addition to removing these negative forces, there's also acts that we can take to empower people, to give them the capacity as human beings. So education is a primary example of this, but just economic order is another example of it. Just political systems is another example of it. A global order that can free people of war and terrorism and oppression of various kinds is another example of it. So all of these core things, one element is just about the essential capabilities of what it means to be human, and every human being's right to exercise that, and therefore be a protagonist in the building of a global society, and in the exercise of the powers of a global society. But then, of course, beyond those core capabilities, then there are also aspirations or desires we have as human beings. But then the question becomes, well, how do you learn to exercise those in a proper way? Because some of those aspirations might be in line with what it means, what this capacity that Baha'u'llah is describing of what it means to be a human being. And he describes that, for example, as being exercised according to a twofold moral purpose. One element of that is our inner life and character, where we live a good life, a life worthy of a good human being. The other, where we contribute to the advancement of society, the betterment of the world, and an ever-advancing civilization. So it's the exercise of our aspirations as well could also lead to that living of a good life or that contributing to the betterment of society. So we decide, what are we going to do with our professional self? So maybe I want to be a doctor, or maybe I want to be a business person, or maybe I want to be a teacher. So all these can all be equally noble aspirations. But then also someone might aspire to selling drugs, contributing to war, becoming a terrorist to promote their own ideology, and so on. So human beings need then the things that also not only release their capability to be an actor, but then channels that action toward their twofold moral purpose in a constructive way. And so that's the purpose of the divine teaching and divine law, so that it's not just a freedom to do what we want, but also a freedom that lifts us from our desires, so that these divine laws channel our aspirations in constructive directions. So, for example, like if you look at airplanes that fly all over the world and gives this marvelous freedom to the human race to go to this part of the world, to go to that part of the world, and so on. But it doesn't happen because pilots can do whatever they want to do. It happens because there's a set of rules. Well, like one idea is, don't crash into the ground. Don't fly into outer space. Don't crash into another airplane. So you have rules and structure and guidance, but the aim is freedom, freedom of travel, not restriction. In the same way, divine law, divine teachings, divine exhortations act in the same way to channel us in constructive ways. So it's this release of human capacity to be a protagonist in the building of this world that's fundamental then to the structure of individual communities and institutions. Because it's not just the individual alone, but it's also the part the individual plays, the collective action that's formed by the community that canalizes the energy of many individuals into a forward thrust of society. And that the purpose of institutions then is not to direct and exercise control over these individuals, but to empower them and free them in order to exercise their twofold moral purpose in maybe very different, but ultimately very constructive ways. So this is another of the aspects of Baha'u'llah's profound teachings. And when we see individuals who are motivated by that sense of what it means to be a human being, and then they also exist in many other spaces, as a member of a national community, as a member of a tribal group, as a member of another religion, and so on. But then each becomes, by bringing this sense of the oneness of humanity into all these diverse spaces, all these broken shards of identity, what it begins to do is catalyze a different kind of thought and a different kind of action that gradually allows, without contending and imposing on one another, gradually allows, because of a change of thought about who I am and what I ought to do, a change of a pattern of action that can gradually bring these fragmented pieces together. Another of the important teachings of Baha'u'llah is this idea that the struggle for existence is the supreme calamity, as Abdu'l-Baha phrases it. So human beings are not engaged in competition with one another. We're engaged with cooperation with one another. And if we are not free in this way that Baha'u'llah describes, then we just exhibit these animal aspects of our impulses. We're looking at what we want, what we desire, in competition with other human beings, and then you see this fragmentation come in society. It takes its form in many ways. There's this social Darwinian thought that even groups of people are engaged in a Darwinian struggle for existence in competition with one another. But even our economics, our law, our politics, even academics, is set up on a dynamic of argumentation and conflict. Now, of course, Abdu'l-Baha gives a very different image. He says that the purpose of life is to contribute to the betterment. The highest honor of a person is contributing to the betterment of the world. Whereas a life lived in pursuit of your own self-interest is a wasted life. Along this lines, Baha'u'llah also redefines the concept of human honor. In other words, what is it that in the life of a person brings them a good reputation, a good repute with their fellow citizens? Well, if the world is ordered according to this framework of competition, well, then it's whoever competes the best, whoever accumulates the most money, whoever exerts their will over others, and so on, has political power, or even social power, an influence over others. And in this person against person, well, you look up to somebody like that, and you want them to get things for your group over other groups, and so on. But Baha'u'llah changes that dynamic of honor. He says, again, it's in pursuit of this twofold moral purpose. A person who serves humanity, a person who becomes distinguished for these spiritual qualities, is deserving of the honor and respect from their fellow human beings. And thus, the emphasis on a sense of shame when we don't pattern our activity in this direction, and so on. Abdu'l-Baha said, the honor and distinction of the individual consists in this, that he, among all the world's multitudes, should become a source of social good. How excellent, how honorable is man, if he arises to fill his responsibilities. How wretched and contemptible, if he shuts his eyes to the welfare of society and wastes his precious life in pursuing his own selfish interests and personal advantages. Now, I have many more points. I'll just give two more. One, I think, again, is the sense that gives in the Baha'i teachings that a human being is in the act of becoming. This is a very important idea, that wherever we are, I mean, it's fundamental to the teachings of the faith, that wherever we are, we're engaged in a process of change and development. So I'm constantly in the effort to improve my own life, to live a good life. I'm constantly in an effort to contribute to the building of a better society. So we know in the future as Baha'is, the Baha'is of the future will be better than we are today. That's our aim. My aim is that my children surpass me as a Baha'i, and that my grandchildren surpass them. I mean, otherwise, every day we have this discipline that Baha'u'llah has us to pray every day, to read the writings every day, to take ourselves into account each day, in order to make tomorrow better than today. Many elements of human society don't see progress, don't necessarily see that the direction of civilization is forward. But even in this dire darkness that we see around us, Baha'is have every expectation that the outcome of this process, no matter how calamitous, is the movement to this next stage of human social development. First through the Great Peace, which establishes the material order of humanity, but then in the centuries that follow, the most great peace, the spiritualization of this human family. So this is tied with the process that the House of Justice has been emphasizing in recent years of study, consultation, action, and reflection. So we have to learn to translate what Baha'u'llah said into reality. We have to learn to translate the findings of the systems of science into practical action. But in that is just not anything that science finds, any material step forward, but a step of combining the material and spiritual to lead to an equitable and just human civilization. If we look, for example, at the economic order, well, we have the basic needs of humanity. We have the carrying capacity of the earth. So a just economic order is something that falls in between those. That human need is met, like Abdu'l-Baha says, that even the poorest person has a home, has food, has secure health and retirement, and so on. Now, he's not saying that all classes will be collapsed into one. There will be wealth, there will be those who have less wealth, but a just system ensures that everybody has these minimal needs met, so again, they can exercise their capability as a human being. So they can have voice, so they can have agency, so they can live a good life, a life that manifests spiritual qualities and leads to their own contribution to the building of a new civilization. So if we don't have knowledge of how to do something, we have this system of how to acquire it. So we study, we act, reflect. We reflect on our action and then we change it. So this process is true for our own individual life. It's also true for society as a whole. So we have to learn this pattern in our own life and communities. We have to also engage in the spaces that we're in the wider society in the same process. So that in place of conflict and contention, to impose your idea of reality on the rest of humanity, or to impose your idea of right and wrong on the rest of humanity, which only provokes a counter-reaction with somebody then looking to come back and impose their idea of what's right and their idea of what's wrong on top of you. And so humanity is in this constant state of flux. So this capability is a transition needed for the age of human maturity. Finally, because time is running out, the last point I want to make, that one of these critical teachings of Baha'u'llah is about the idea that the Baha'i community itself is a leaven. Now, if you look, especially at this movement toward the great peace, the lesser peace, it's not Baha'is who will establish it. It's humanity that will establish it. And Baha'is are only a small ingredient in that whole. But just like a loaf of bread, if you want the bread to rise, you need an ingredient in there that acts in a different way and doesn't act according to all the other ingredients. But it adds a little bit of a difference and then creates the change and causes the bread to rise. So Baha'u'llah's expectation is that a community will arise that will actually put in place his teachings. I mean, if we won't do it, why do we expect anybody else will do it? If our tendency is to just act like everybody else, so now a problem arises in the world, and then we're on Facebook, and we sound just like everybody else on Facebook. Why? Is that what it means to be a Baha'i? What does it mean to be 11? Then we should be a voice in that space that says something different, that catalyzes a different way of thinking and a different way of approaching the problem. Otherwise, we're just feeding the flame that's devouring the earth, rather than, being that ingredient which will get humanity to begin to look at things in a different way. Abdu'l-Baha says, "O army of God, make ye a mighty effort. Perchance ye can flood this earth with light, that this mud hut, the world, may become the Abha paradise. The dark hath taken over, and the brute traits prevail. This world of man is now an arena for wild beasts, a field where the ignorant, the heedless, seize their chance. The souls of men are ravening wolves and animals with blinded eyes. They are either deadly poison or useless weeds, all except for a very few who indeed do nurture altruistic aims and plans for the well-being of their fellow men. But ye must, in this matter, that is, the serving of humankind, lay down your very lives, and as ye yield them yourselves, rejoice. So in this arena, some have to arise to begin the process of constructing peace and order out of a disintegrating society. And Baha'u'llah has raised the community to be that. And Abdu'l-Baha expects us not just to do it, but to be willing to sacrifice our lives to do it. It's the kind of dimension we see with the Baha'is in Iran, with the Baha'is in Yemen, who, because they're doing these same processes, face oppression, hardship, imprisonment, and even potential loss of life to be able to do it. Now, friends, that brings me kind of full circle to the efforts that the Baha'i community is exerting in the world right now. If we look at the activity in the various clusters in the world and what the plans that we're engaged in are calling us to do, I think you'll see that what we're doing is exactly what these deeper teachings of Baha'u'llah are calling us to do. We're actually putting these deeper ideas into practice. So this process of learning, we're engaged in it. And we're not just engaged in it, but we're trying to teach others to do it. This idea of the oneness of humanity, a sense of identity, that's what we're creating in people who are engaged in the activities where we're engaged. So a young person engaged in the junior youth program expresses themselves and says, well, what I'm doing is I'm working in my village in order to unite the people of my village so that then we could unite the people of our province, so we can unite the people of our nation, so we can unite the people of the world. So this is from a young woman, 16-year-old, who maybe will never leave her village or not wander very far from it. And yet she sees herself deeply engaged in the processes of the village, but working in the context of a united world. And that's the system that we have in the Baha'i world. We're educating children, junior youth to be protagonists of that process. We're creating community spaces where these ideas can be put into practice and learned. We're creating this idea of honor that Baha'u'llah describes in honoring those who commit themselves to this path of service. And we're working together with everyone, whether they're Baha'is, whether they're not Baha'is, whether they have this identity, that identity. We're trying to work as a common whole and create a pattern where different people with different ideas can work together and solve their problems in a collective way. In a sense, this is Shoghi Effendi's idea about the nucleus and pattern of a new world order. We think of it as some abstract thing, or maybe just related to the administration. But actually, it's the workings of people in spaces in different ways, and becoming something different than the world already has. Now, as we look then at the growth of the faith over the years, what we can see is a change in the pattern of action that has taken place over time. So when Abdu'l-Baha passed away, the Baha'is had certain ideas about themselves. They didn't know much about administration. They were personally connected to Abdu'l-Baha. They saw the Baha'i faith maybe as the spirit of the age. They considered themselves Baha'is, but they also went to their church. And so this was one way of thinking and acting as Baha'is. But when Shoghi Effendi became guardian, he gradually started to teach the Baha'is more about what the Baha'i teachings actually contain, about the administration, about the concept of teaching plans, and so on. Now, Shoghi Effendi described the model of the growth of the faith, and he said the first stage would be steady flow of fresh recruits. This would be followed by a series of increased movement of people into the faith that he called entry by troops. And then following some series of events that would derange the equilibrium of the world, would lead to the mass conversion of people into the nations, into the faith, nations and peoples into the faith. So Shoghi Effendi went about building this first pattern of steady flow of fresh recruits. And basically what he taught was, well, we need to settle in a place, we need to teach the faith, we need to raise up 9 or more people, we need to form a local assembly, then some people should go to the next place. They should go to a place internationally if they can, or they should go nationally if they can, and gradually the faith will spread and establish communities all over the globe and open all the countries. And added to that, when the House of Justice was established, were ideas for children's classes and activities for women, regular assembly meetings, feasts and holy days. That pattern that Shoghi Effendi set in place kind of filled itself out into a basic community life, which generally, again, most of us, not maybe the younger folks so much, knew as the pattern of Baha'i life. But when you looked at those communities, maybe, you know, they could grow to a size of maybe several hundred active people. And in fact, most of them didn't grow that big. There were 30, there were 15, there were 9. Even when we saw there was only a single person, we didn't say, oh, you know, it doesn't work here, the Baha'i faith doesn't work here. No, it's like, oh good, you now have 1, you need to now teach and try to get 9. So this is the pattern that we knew, a pattern that reflected the stage of steady flow of fresh recruits in creating a certain model of life. But the House of Justice said to us that this model of a strong community, dedicated, vibrant, with energy, but of limited number, maybe even carrying out a humanitarian project, was not capable of affecting a change in society. And so we had to move to the next paradigm of action, which is this paradigm of entry by troops. Now, entry by troops began in the 10-year crusade. We learned how to attract a lot of people to the faith, but we didn't learn how to consolidate them into systematic patterns of community life. But in recent plans, by focusing on that, now if you look, we're trying to move 5,000 clusters around the world. Several hundred of them are at the point where 100 or more people are carrying on a pattern of life that engages 1,000 or more. So already multiple times bigger than the stage of a paradigm of steady flow of fresh recruits. And in the strongest of these clusters, there's more than 10,000 people who are engaged in the pattern of activity, learning how to engage 50,000, which is kind of the next target that they're aimed at. So we went through one organic stage of our development, then learned about another one. But again, this pattern now has to spread across the globe. It's not enough that it's in a few places, or it's not enough that at the level of 1,000 or 2,000, it's in a few hundred places, while another almost 5,000 clusters stand behind that, maybe working with less than 100 people. Well, these also have to learn the path that will take them to this higher level. And then when they get there, what we're seeing is different things begin to kick into place. And so these are some of the things that you're beginning to see on these videos. It's not everywhere, but it is possible now to get there. But what we're seeing, for example, like I gave you that example of junior youth program in Kiribati, where when you hit enough numbers, less people are going to prison, an official sense. Where we see in the Central African Republic a network of schools, much like those Abdu'l Baha had envisioned for Iran, maybe on a much more rudimentary level, but a school system for a country that's engaged in conflict where this system can match and even surpass what the government schools are able to do, and Baha'is become part of the conversation in the country about how to educate the entire population. We see in certain villages in India where this pattern of activity is embracing the entire population of the village, that the process of the caste system begins to disintegrate. There's one story of a village where the Baha'is went to the people activities were starting in the village. And they said, well, we want to educate your children. They said, fine, but keep them all segregated by the different castes. And so I said, well, okay, fine. But with the animators and children's class teachers, we can't train separate classes for all of them. We have to bring them all together. So they said, okay, you can bring the teachers of the children together. And so with that start, then, the process of beginning to break down the barriers of caste started to fall. And then when the classes progressed, they would gather on one day to celebrate the accomplishments of the children. So the whole village would gather. Within a period of 2 years, people were not thinking about the caste system anymore. And so people were doing things unprecedented. Higher caste cooking for lower caste, or even lower caste cooking for higher caste, which didn't happen either. And so these differences were removed, and people saw themselves as one. In one of the communities in the Democratic Republic of Congo, they talked about a village where everybody became involved in the core activities, and they said that the people became united, and spiritually as well as materially, and began to feel like one family. And they said that they used to lock their animals up at night in order to protect them so they wouldn't be stolen and so on. And then people thought, well, we don't need to do that. Nobody would even think of stealing from one of their brothers or sisters and so on. And then they tell a story where somebody came to the village and they sat the person down and they said, look, we're like one family. We're all united. We would never take from one another. So if anything happens, we know who did it. So again, these are all anecdotal things, but what they start to show is this process of change. Beyond this level of, a very good community, what we're seeing now is a dynamic that operates at a much bigger level that actually does have a capacity to impact the society around it, to affect a profound change. Something like the caste system, which existed for centuries, if not millennia, don't know the dates, but the point is that it melts away in the matter of a year or two under this pattern of action of learning how to put Baha'u'llah's teachings into action and serving as a leaven that crystallizes a change in the whole pattern of the community. So this thing now is seen not just by the Baha'is saying it and describing it, but also in the bicentennial events. Many of the officials who commented were commenting on the change they saw. Of course, many of these are official things. The governor declares that this is the day of the bicentennial, Baha'u'llah, and so on. So they're just kind of procedural things. But some of the comments saw right to the heart of what we were doing and saw it as something that was essential to humanity, especially those who were associated with the United Nations. So one individual who was associated with the Human Rights Division of the High Commissioner for Human Rights said, one of the first quotes that struck me from the Baha'i faith is that all human beings have been created to carry forward an ever-advancing civilization. There are two distinct features, I think, in the Baha'i faith which are crystal clear. One is this commonality that we are all contributing to something. It is a faith which is open, and that is the first feature of a healthy contribution to humanity. Secondly, it is a community which is very active in world affairs, social affairs, economic affairs, United Nations affairs, not from within a theological standpoint, but from a humane standpoint. Another representative of one country to the United Nations said, Baha'u'llah asked each of us to develop a sense of world citizenship and a commitment to stewardship of the earth. As Baha'is, you have the knowledge that can pave the way for a brighter future for generations to come. And now, more than ever, the voices of the followers of Baha'u'llah need to be heard, and those teachings extended beyond that, which I know you work hard at doing every day. We look forward to your support and collaboration as together we build a world where there is no place for otherness, where peace is no longer an illusion, and in this way, truly achieving Baha'u'llah's vision for heaven on earth. So these are just some examples, but at different levels, officials seeing now that Baha'is have gone beyond the level of just ideas into a pattern of action that can embrace others and can affect a profound and needed change in society. And so when they see that, they ask for more. And so, of course, the question is, will we deliver that more? So this gets us then to, maybe I can take a little aside now and just say now, here's what you're doing in the United States. And maybe there's things that we can do to build on that. So you're working now on 650 clusters in the course of this plan to raise them to a level of intensive program of growth. One of the things in these activities that it's important to keep in mind is to think in terms of what we're doing, not in terms of things, but in terms of people. It's very easy to think in terms of things. We have to have these activities. How many do we have? We have to study some books. Here's another document that we need to study. And so there's a constant pattern of activity. What's the calendar look like? What do we do here? And so it's natural. Maybe it's even part of the way that we use language, that we talk in terms of things and we keep track of things. But we have to remember that the nature of all these things is not the purpose of the plan. It's not the end of the plan. The end of the plan, the aim of the plan is these human beings and the capacity of these human beings to be human beings and to exercise their freedom in this sense of the freedom that Baha'u'llah wants for them, and their voice and their agency and their ability to live a good life and their ability to contribute to an ever-advancing civilization. So the purpose of the plan is to go in and to find those individuals and help them to develop their capability to do that. So in every cluster, the idea is to aim at raising a group of people who, whatever level that they're able to function at, can try to understand what Baha'u'llah said and then translate it into action. And then to grow that circle of people. So, for example, if we are the few people in our cluster, do we have the capability to go and talk to people about Baha'u'llah and attract them to come to some activity? I doubt that we're sitting around with that capacity and not exercising. I mean, we all can do that and we don't do it. So then we have to look and say, well, actually, I don't know how to do that. I try, but then they don't want to come. Or they come once and then they don't come back. So the first step then is to build that capability. If we don't know what to say, we have to figure it out. We have to talk to people and then make a mistake and then try again. The courses of the Institute are there to help us, but it's not something that you learn by studying a book. Finally, the book can help us, can try to raise up a group, can try to exercise some of those capabilities, but then we have to go out and do it. And then we learn that part and they come, great. Now what happens? What do we do with them next? So if I come, is the purpose that they just come to the event and then they go home and then I have another thing, I had this meeting, so check, devotional meeting, check. But think about the nature of what a devotional meeting can be. Here's a space where you bring people and you expose them to the Word of God. And then you begin to engage them in an elevated conversation. So if I'm thinking of the people, then I'm thinking of every person who came to my home for this devotional meeting. And what is the capacity of that person? And how do I see that person as a creation of God, like myself? One, a member of the family. And what can I do to help to build the capability of that person? Or to give them a space so that they can translate that capability that they already have into a pattern of action for the education of children or for junior youth, for social action, for involvement in the discourses of society, to look at the different problems that we're facing in our neighborhood or in our society, to begin to look at how Baha'u'llah's teachings shed light on that different problem. That's the nature of what we're trying to do in those spaces, all of them. It's about building capability of people, increasing the number of people who have that capability, and setting in motion a movement in the individual life to live the twofold moral purpose, but also in the community to become a protagonist for channeling the energies of those people and gradually making a forward movement in addressing the problems of the society. This is the purpose of the activity in our clusters. Shoghi Effendi mentioned in the Advent of Divine Justice, when he talked about these three evil tendencies, he called upon the Baha'is. He said, first, you're too small to tackle these evil tendencies yourself. So you should work on yourself. The leaven has to develop its leavenly powers. So we need rectitude of conduct. We need a chaste and holy life. We need an association free of prejudice, so that when we're called upon, we can eliminate those problems from the fabric of American society. And he said, until the majority of your countrymen are freed from these three evil tendencies, the world order of Baha'u'llah cannot emerge. So this is our task. In the centenary of the Divine Plan, the House of Justice wrote a brief letter to the Baha'is of the United States and Canada and talked about how the challenge that we're engaged in now in the creation of these clusters and the raising up of these groups of people with the capability to translate Baha'u'llah's teachings into reality and action to change their inner and outer life, that is a straight line from what the Guardian called for in the Advent of Divine Justice and right from the very beginning in 1921 to the point that we can look to in the future when the Baha'i community will eliminate these problems from the fabric of society. But it has to take place, the House of Justice said, in these clusters that you're raising that move to the furthest frontiers of learning. Where's the cluster in the United States that has 10,000 people engaged in a pattern of activity? Where are the neighborhoods and centers around which people are learning to unravel racial prejudice in American society in the same way the Baha'is of India are learning how to unravel the caste system? This is what we're being called upon to do. In the Advent of Divine Justice, Shoghi Effendi calls upon the Baha'is to bring this idea of racial unity. He said it should be your watchword in every aspect of your life, in your home, in your family, in your schools, in all your Baha'i activities. What he's saying is, in every space you inhabit, you should be bringing this principle to bear. And if it's not there, then you should work to do it. So it's not just a matter of some kind of course or something that's going to alleviate from this. It's the spaces we create where human beings can come together and become like one family and work out their problems and differences and make mistakes and feel bad, but then solve problems. Now the House of Justice is asking the same thing in these areas of community building, in these areas of social action, in the spaces we inhabit in our professional life or our personal life, where we're involved in the discourses of society with other human beings. Freedom from prejudice should be a watchword of the Baha'i community. So we should create spaces, and in those spaces, we should unravel the problems that are bedeviling the wider society. And then put ourselves on a path, even though maybe we don't know much about it today, but 20 years ago, the House of Justice couldn't even describe what an intensive program of growth was, because we didn't have any. All it could say is a few prerequisites. Now we have patterns of activity that engage more than 10,000 people, and it's less than 20 years. So the same thing, the National Assembly now is guiding the Friends in these areas. Right now we have scores of clusters where this dimension of engagement on the issues of race is a part of the pattern of community building in those clusters, part of the conversations, part of the action. We have hundreds of activities, even though they're very small, for social action around the question of race. And we have thousands of Baha'is who are in spaces raising these issues in various ways. So if we have these things already in motion, how do we apply also a process of learning, of consultation, action, and reflection to our community building, social action, involvement in discourses, so that 5 years from now, it's much better, more broad, and more profound than it is today? And again, not activities, but about human capacity to act on these issues and to arrange human life into a different kind of pattern. And if we can advance it in 5 years, what happens when we can advance it over 10 years? The House of Justice has already raised the vision of the Baha'i world now in the Rizvan message. We have, of course, these last few years, we have to exert all of our energy to take the plan as far as we can. But then the horizon is already raised into a series of plans in the next plan. First, a 1-year plan that it surrounds this anniversary of the passing of Abdul Baha, centenary of his passing, and the establishment of the covenant and the administrative order and so on. So we'll reflect on that even as we continue to act. But then setting a stage for a series of plans into the year 2044, the end of the second Baha'i century. The second Baha'i century, where Shoghi Effendi said, we'll see the first stirrings of Baha'u'llah's world order. But remember, there was a caveat with that. If you do what you're supposed to do, it's not going to happen. Don't look for anybody else to do this, Shoghi Effendi said. Several countries in the world are propelling along in profound ways. I mean, for the first time, a couple countries have passed you in the number of clusters that have advanced to the second milestone. So that's just the first time that happened. But I'm sure, I have every confidence. But friends, look, we've paralyzed ourselves for too long getting caught up in the nuts and bolts of this thing and missing the bigger picture. How many of the friends still are not participating in an active way in finding how they could create a space to contribute to this capacity building process and to work with others in a collective way to advance the movement of this process in their cluster? Many years ago, especially some of the more veteran Baha'is like myself might recall a time when the process of entry by troops began in the United States, in the southern part of the United States, on Native American reservations and so on. And we began to develop the same pattern that the world itself saw. Very quickly, people would enroll, but then the consolidation process would struggle. And so the Baha'i community in the United States wasn't sure, what should we do here and so on. And the House of Justice wrote at that time, and they said that, look, new methods inevitably bring with them criticism. But the response of the masses in itself is a call for the veteran believers to join with others, to join with the young people in carrying the message of Baha'u'llah to all of these places. That quote applies today. We have maybe 7,000 core activities, many, of course, other activities around it for teaching and visits and so on that are going on in the United States. But if we had a groundswell of more believers who would step up to be protagonists of that process, that number could double. And the goals of the plan would follow. And the process that was envisioned by Shoghi Effendi would advance more significantly. We don't have the capacity right now to eliminate racial prejudice, moral laxity, or political corruption from American society. But if we don't know how, then we have to take the first steps to learn. It doesn't mean that we won't know how in 30 years from now if we study, consult, act, and reflect in systematic ways, in ever larger number, in building the capacity of more and more people in the country, whether they become Baha'is or not, to engage in this transformative process. Then that can become a reality. And this is our task. Now, friends, I want to leave you with one last quotation from Abdul Baha. He said, to sum it up, the ancient beauty was ever, during his sojourn in this transitory world, either a captive bound with chains, or living under a sword, or subjected to extreme suffering and torment, or held in the most great prison. His reason for putting on the heavy iron chains and for becoming the very embodiment of utter resignation and meekness, was to lead every soul on earth to concord, to fellow feeling, to oneness, to make known amongst all people the signs of the singleness of God, so that at last the primal oneness deposited at the heart of all created things would bear its destined fruit. Now is the time, O ye beloved of the Lord, for ardent endeavor. Struggle ye and strive. And since the ancient beauty was exposed by day and night on the field of martyrdom, let us in our turn labor hard and hear and ponder the counsels of God. Let us fling away our lives and renounce our brief and numbered days. Let us turn our eyes away from empty fantasies of this world's divergent forms and serve instead this preeminent purpose, this grand design. The glory rest upon you and God's mercy and God's blessings. Thank you for